Hello everyone, I'm Ben Eagle, a rural affairs podcaster, and welcome to the first of two Young Farmers podcast episodes in which we're talking about the opportunities and threats for young people in rural businesses today, and encouraging you to ask whether starting a business is the right thing for you and what skills you might need to prepare for your future. NFYFC has developed and delivered various forms of business training over the years, but this is about encouraging you to think differently about the opportunities available to you. We're going to explore issues such as growing a business, the challenges and opportunities of policy change, land use, supply chains, contracts, mindset, networks, CPD, and the attributes that you need to run a rural business. Most importantly, though, is running a business something that you would enjoy and relish, or would you thrive more with a different opportunity? So these are all things just to bear in mind as we go through. In this first episode, we'll be exploring the context of rural businesses for people starting out, whether that's starting your own business or joining a rural business as an employee. Then in the second episode, we'll be focusing on what you should expect if you start your own rural business and the skills that you may need. And I'm joined today by two guests who are going to shine some light on all this. First up, I want to welcome Dr. Richard Byrne, who is a senior lecturer in land management and food security at Harper Adams University. Richard is also part of the Rural Resilience Research Group there. And I'm also joined by Polly Gibb, OBE, who is also based at Harper and is the Director of Women in Rural Enterprise. And after that very lengthy introduction, welcome to you both. Thank you for doing this. Polly, let's start with you. Can you introduce yourself briefly and your work at Women in Rural Enterprise?
Okay, so I'm Polly, and I've worked for about 20 years with Wire. And what we've done over the last 20 years is work predominantly with women and predominantly in rural areas, women who are either setting up or growing a business based in a rural area, some based on farms, some just generally in the rural area. Some of these businesses we've been through sort of almost the whole 20 years. And then more recently, I've been working at Harper Adams with agri-tech businesses and foodie businesses with growth courses and startup courses.
And Richard, over to you. Can you introduce yourself, please?
I've been at Harper now 25 years. I'm mostly teaching and researching the area of agricultural policy. Probably the last 10 years, I've moved more looking at food security in terms of what we produce in the UK, but also what's being produced around the world and how we feed a growing global population.
Thank you both. So when we talk about business opportunities for young people, we're referring here, for the purposes of this podcast, to both starting a business, but also working in a business. Polly, why is it important that new entrants have an understanding of business, even if they aren't necessarily starting their own?
I think this is a real key question, actually. We've moved very much from the time when we were thinking of entrepreneurialism. I wouldn't really call it understanding business. I would talk about entrepreneurialism and innovation. I think for me, those are the kind of key words and key concepts. Very much, we're not in the time when it's just if you want to start your own business. I think particularly small businesses, but all businesses need these skills in their young people that are joining them. And there are all sorts of reasons, but I kind of hone in on two sort of areas. The first of which is about basically profit margins. It's about you want to make a living and you need to make a living. It's about generating some kind of surplus on your activities because that's where your living comes from. And I think the days of primary production, making a lot of stuff and having very tight margins, particularly for smaller businesses and rural businesses and agriculture businesses, those days are past really. And so an understanding of customer, an understanding of exactly what it is that you are producing and wanting your customer to buy, and an understanding of the need to make a margin on that, to sell your goods and your services for more than it's cost you to produce them. Sounds really simple, but these are all things that aren't, when you're actually doing the day-to-day, they aren't just self-evident. It's very easy to lose sight of. Those things are very, very important. So have a real understanding of customer and your business model. That's really important for any business. And the other sort of general area I'd say is that it's a time of huge change. The pace of change and the amount of change in what customers are looking for, in technology, the possibilities, the marketplace. And so to be working for a business or running your own business, to be innovative, willing to take risks, willing to try out new ideas. So sort of generally entrepreneurial and business-like, I think are really, really important skills.
Yeah, thank you for that, both for giving us some context, but also the importance of concepts. And I think certainly that understanding of risk is something that we're going to relate throughout this conversation. Richard, let's go over to you. So we're now halfway through the agricultural transition period, referencing the new ag policy in England, certainly. How have things changed since the early days of Brexit with this? So can you give us some context and whether, in your view, there are any new challenges or opportunities that have come about as a result?
The challenge of Brexit has brought fluctuations to our ability to trade freely with Europe, which has also created opportunities within the UK to develop product lines and to develop enterprises. It's also made things like inputs either more expensive or less reliable in their delivery. The days of next day delivery for things like spares and things like that is pretty much behind us now. I think, though, the biggest influence there has been climate change. I think we've seen a real acceleration in sort of the uncertainty of our weather conditions and our growing conditions in the UK. Only last week we had that very heavy rain. A lot of autumn planting was washed out. We had a very poor spring. We've had intermittent dry periods and heavy rain over the summer period. And I think things are becoming a lot more challenging in that area. And that means we've got to look at the enterprise not only as what are we producing for the market, but what offers the most resilience to deliver something to the market. The other big challenge is coming with the cost of living crisis. On the back of that, though, we have seen a growth, not a huge growth, but certainly a growth in people's willingness to spend money on quality and on products with a story behind them, something which they actually see a higher value in because of how they've been produced, where they've been produced, or what other things they're offering. It's a time of real challenge, but I also think it's a time to really sit back and try and understand what's going on around us and to see opportunity in that.
I like that. There's the opportunity of storytelling. You also use the word resilience there, which is, of course, a buzzword that's used a lot. Another word that we hear a lot at the moment is uncertainty. And Polly, I think it would be true to say that we live in the context of quite a chaotic world at the moment. With all that, what does that mean with a business hat on? What does that mean for new rural businesses, or critically those growing a business or thinking about starting a business?
Yeah, it feels like the world's kind of just losing control of itself. And certainly we're sort of, things are going out of control. It does sometimes feel like that. But I think it is what it is, isn't it? For me, for businesses, you think, well, what's the opportunity in that? And what's the silver lining on that? For small businesses, for startup businesses, they are very fleet of foot. They can pivot quickly. You can respond to the market. You can respond to change. It's not kind of ideal. It would be lovely if everything was predictable and you could make lovely plans that you could then implement and it would all be wonderful. But actually, if you're wanting to start a business, you have to embrace risk. You have to be of the attitude and the personality that you can cope with risk, any kind of business. And really, this is just doubling down on that, really. So I think look at it as a bonus that if you're a tiny little business, you can move quicker than the big businesses. You're closer to your marketplace. You should understand your customers better. And actually, you can pivot and move around quicker than the other guys. And by the time they're sort of moving around to respond to the change, there'll be another change and off you go again. So I think it's just have your fingertips on the pulse of your business and think actually being successful in business now is about responding to change. It's not implementing my plans beautifully.
Yeah. One example that I can raise of that, there's a farm shop in Norfolk who pretty much launched their business during COVID on the back of the toilet roll crisis. So that was a big part of it, and they added lots of products around that. And now they actually have quite a thriving farm shop business. But it was about grasping that opportunity at the time.
Yes, and being able to just go with it.
Richard, there's a lot of talk about needing to invest more in our national infrastructure, especially when it comes to rural. What do you think Defra and the government should be investing in? There's lots of choices at the moment, but what should the priorities be?
IT communications, connectivity is the really big piece here. I'm aware of, Polly was saying, the energy with young people at the moment outstrips anything you see in the main agricultural sectors. Positivity amongst young people is pretty high, and willingness to try things is very, very high. But what often retards their business is ability to connect with people. We did a survey at Harper just before COVID about rural businesses in the Lake District. And these were all different kinds of rural businesses. They were everything from farm shops, butcheries, to craft shops and stuff like that. And every single one out of about 50 responses said connectivity was their limiting factor, whether it's not being able to have the website that they wanted to have to display what they want to have because of bandwidth restrictions or lack of mobile phone signal to take bookings or orders. Everything was held back, and there was such energy there wanting to do things and showcase the great things that come out of the Lake District. And what an icon of a landscape reflecting food production. And that was just a really big thing. So I think my number one would be digital connectivity. We also need to invest in more tangible things, roads, public transport, all that kind of personal connectivity. A lot of people have great ideas, got energy, but they may not drive. Or it might be, I know in Shropshire, we had a scheme a few years ago where rural young people could lease a moped. Fantastic. But, the road conditions were so poor. You take your life in your hands if you're not careful. Better physical connectivity so young people can work together, work with other people to access banking, to access finance, to access training. These are all things that underpin a successful economy.
Yeah, I find it incredible. Sometimes I'll do calls out to somewhere in the middle of nowhere in the States, say Montana or somewhere, and their connection is so good. Is so clear. And then you can do a call down the road here and you're going to be really struggling. Polly, we'll sort of focus on ag, which is the main sort of focus of this podcast. But do you think we focus too much on agriculture in the rural sector? We were talking about connection and hopefully great potential for digital businesses in the countryside. There are numerous other opportunities for younger people and new entrants outside of agriculture.
Yeah, there are. I don't know whether we concentrate too much on ag. It kind of depends who's speaking and what they're speaking about. But there always is a sort of underlying presumption that it is all about agriculture in rural areas, when actually it's an absolute sort of tapestry of businesses that are all very, very interconnected. Agriculture is there producing the food, and then there's a whole supply chain to the consumer, often sort of woven through the rural area. What I would say is, if you're a young person, don't be too focused on agriculture. Be a little bit open-minded. It depends what people's motivation is. So if it's a young person, a new entrant who just loves cows and wants to have a herd of cows, and that's what they want to do and that's what they dream of, then they need to find a way of earning a living from their herd of cows. But if it's a young person who wants to live in a rural area, or who sort of has ties in a rural area that they want to, and they just want to create themselves a living, I would say look wider than agriculture, because probably the opportunities for you are elsewhere.
Richard, what is the role of organisations like TIA, Landex, the land-based colleges, Harper as well, I suppose, in preparing younger people for this new context? And this is perhaps a bit of a loaded question, but how successful are they being from your point of view?
The whole sector is doing a good job, but we can do a lot better. I think all the land-based colleges in the UK have gone through a period of reflection post-COVID, and courses that have been written post-COVID are in a different kind of framework. So, for example, at Harper, it's hardcore agriculture. It's sowing rates, it's fertilizer, the fundamental building blocks. But on top of that, you will also have to do business. You will have to do IT. You'll have to do a bit of law. You'll have to do personnel management, HR type stuff as well, because you're going to probably be an employer. And it's important to know that equipping the student to be an entrepreneur, to go out and do things on their own, as well as being an employee or to be part of a smaller team in terms of a startup. It's adding value to the skill set. I think for many years, we were very much focused on core skills. So this is nutrient management planning. Actually, now we say, okay, this is nutrient management planning. This is why it's really important. There's a legal framework, but also it's cost saving. It's also compliance. It also allows you to talk positively to supply chains. You are doing these things to protect the environment. That's part of that really important narrative. And it's demonstrable because you are following a protocol. And then that's where we've all changed. I think the land-based colleges, county ag colleges, we used to call them, are fundamentally part of this in terms of instilling those core skills in students and young people, but also being a point of reference for people to go back in their career, to pick up new skills.
Polly, can you tell us about Harper's new entrant pilot studies and what the findings of that were?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, we ran a pilot program, which was working with young people and not quite so young people who were new entrants to farming. So they were people who did not own or currently rent a large wodge of land, and they were wanting to enter that sector. Some of them had a small herd of sheep and they wanted to expand that. And some of them really were sort of right at the starting line and they hadn't made an entry at all. So we worked with them over a period of almost a year, doing some training activities, a lot of networking activities. I think there were two objectives. One was to reduce the barriers that they face, but also secondly, but more importantly, and I think we were more effective in doing this, it was to equip them with some skills and increase their competence and ability to meet those, sort of to get over those barriers to entry. We learned a lot. The takeaways really, it was a new thing for me. I was involved because of my business sort of background, and it was very much about bringing business skills and business thinking to this group of people might help them in reducing the barriers and sort of equipping them with some skills. So it was a kind of a new area for me, working directly with agriculture, people wanting to work in agriculture. And really the big kind of takeaways for me were the challenges and the barriers that they face are enormous. And they are a very, very marginal group of people. They are marginal to the kind of establishment of agriculture, which is quite traditional, quite slow moving, very capital intense. I mean, the financial barriers to entry are enormous, but also the cultural and kind of network contacts, kind of barriers to entry. They're not connected to the right people. They don't have enough money to get set up. So they are very marginal and the challenges are enormous. But the other takeaway for me was what an amazing bunch of people these are. And such a fantastic opportunity for agriculture because they're innovative. They are unbelievably committed and hardworking. I mean, a lot of them were having they had a full-time job. They had their side hustle of a herd of sheep, and they were coming on our courses. So they were watching recordings of our workshops at midnight. We had to run sessions on Saturday mornings, in the evenings, at lunchtime, just so they could squeeze it in. They are fearless. They are absolutely wanting to embrace risk and give it a go. And they are change makers. So if we want agriculture to change, we need to seriously let them in, reduce some of these actual structural barriers, which we can't do anything. We can make some introductions, but on our pilot, we couldn't really do anything about the structure of land ownership or whether landowners are willing to take a risk with a new entrant. And we can't really do anything about that. But if we're serious about changing agriculture, bringing in new, really innovative sort of ideas into agriculture, we need to find ways of getting these people in because they are the change makers.
We'll leave it there for today, but huge thanks to my guests, Polly Gibb and Dr. Richard Byrne, for coming on. Join us for the next episode in this mini-series in which we'll be talking about what to expect if you start a new business and reflect on some of the skills that you'll need. See you for that, but for now, I'm Ben Eagle, and thank you very much for listening. This podcast was produced by Rural Pod Media for the National Federation of Young Farmers Clubs. The presenter was Ben Eagle, and there was further editorial support from Sarah Palmer. The podcast was supported by Defra.